Can we have our ball back, please? So yeah, I want to try and get into the nitty-gritty of defending a little bit. Can we quantify that? Particularly with our 360 data. So getting straight into it, I'm going to try and build a model to predict the outcome of a possession, so that we can examine like offensive and defensive structures, particularly like with an emphasis on the latter. And really want to, so there's the sort of very micro level view, looking at individual frames and situations, analyzing those, and also, looking at those in terms of can we exploit weaknesses, but also the sort of bigger picture kind of level, looking at sort of team tendencies and, trying to get into that sort of meta game, that push-pull in terms of strategy, how teams change their approach like versus different opponents and like home and away and stuff. So we're going to need a machine learning model. So yeah, first thing we need for our model is a target variable. So that's what we're trying to predict. So I wanted to build something, I wanted to build one single model. I could have built, several different ones and tried to combine them together. But I thought, just in this context, it might be nice to have sort of one unified thing. And really, I want to look at the defensive approach of a team and also quantify the risk profile in a given situation. So we chose to split a possession into 3 different outcomes. Those that end in a shot, and then possessions that don't end in a shot, we split those into a further 2. So short possession chains, those less than 5 seconds, longer possession chains, those greater than 5 seconds. So in terms of like the proportion of our data, about half are classified as long, and then the remaining half is split fairly evenly between the other 2. So really want to focus on the defensive stuff, so off-ball information is key. We know this from watching football, but traditionally, and this has been the sort of weakness of like basic event data, is that essentially, if we plot the information we have about location of the players on the pitch, we have one data point. So 6 different examples here, they're all around the halfway line. If we overlay our 360 frame, so that's the 360 data from the broadcast tracking, we can see that obviously these are completely different contexts from a football point of view. Particularly if you contrast the top row with the bottom row. Some of these scenes have 2 players, some of them have like 10, 15 players. Players under a lot of pressure, passing lanes are blocked, or maybe they've got open passes. It's pretty crucial to kind of understand that. It's important to stress that we only see the players in the broadcast tracking frame. That's going to be denoted by this light blue outline throughout the rest of the talk. And that does prompt a question around, okay, well, how do we handle that restricted field of view and also the differing number of players in the frame? So that sort of brings us on to how we're going to represent the data. So traditional kind of event-based data in football has very much kind of looked like this, really. It's tabular data, you can open it in a spreadsheet, and that's really well suited to a lot of the sort of popular machine learning kind of techniques. It's really well catered towards that. Increasingly, and this is how we build our 360 data and our shot freeze frames, is using image data, increasingly popular, big part of the modern world and increasingly modern football. And finally, the other sort of traditional kind of data source that we might mine is text data. So in a football context, that might be scouting reports. There are models and analyses that we can build, off that kind of information. But from a 360 point of view, maybe we want a different representation of the data. So one of those sort of representations is to encode it as a graph. So in this context, a graph isn't like the sort of plots you might be familiar with from school or on Twitter, obviously. It's a sort of more computer science term where we represent the data as nodes and edges. So in this case, the blue circles are the nodes, and then the edges encode information about sort of relationships between those nodes. And we can represent a lot of information about the context and whatever our sort of application is by encoding information about this graph through its nodes and edges. And the nice thing is that actually representing data as these sort of graph-like structures is pretty well established in football. So a lot of you will be familiar with passing networks. Here's an example from our IQ platform. So in this example, our players are the nodes. Their location on the pitch is represented by their touches. We then have these lines between the players, the edges. Those denote the number of passes between players in a given match. And then we're also encoding even further information in terms of the player's pass volume and also both on the edges and on the players themselves, the expected goal value of the passing moves that they're involved in. And that's, that's a really nice way of encoding a lot of information that's, football relevant And we can use those kind of similar representations in a machine learning model to try and tackle some of our problems. And that's where we take these graph structures and we can pass them through a graph neural network. So this is an increasingly popular method for modeling real-world data. And like a lot of these things, particularly in like the deep learning field, it's become more tractable with just increased computer power and just the constant advances in deep learning techniques. And a lot of this has been prompted by applications in social networks, recommender systems, obviously huge kind of things in the modern world, and also like chemistry and medicine. These ways of representing and modeling data, really well catered for these kind of problems. From a football point of view, and particularly with 360 in mind, it's a method that allows a much more direct representation of the 360 frames. We could try and kind of torture our data into a more kind of tabular format that we're kind of used to and feed that through the more sort of traditional techniques. But we'd have to like handcraft our features. So what I mean by that is, so for example, from a 360 perspective, we want to, okay, how far away is the nearest opposition defender? Okay, cool, I can calculate that. But I also want to probably know where the second closest one is, and the third, and the fourth. And all of a sudden, oh, well, there isn't a fourth, there isn't a third. What am I going to do with that? So it becomes quite difficult to sort of try and handcraft all of that. But we can use these graph-like structures to preserve a lot of the rich information and have a much better representation of what is actually, what the actual data looks like. And then we can use that representation and also encode our sort of football domain expertise on the nodes and edges to help out when we're building our models. So in terms of the features going into the model, so similarly to our on-ball value OBV model, we consider possession states to represent our events. So that's denoted by the location on the pitch, the context, so like open play, free kick, body part, and in our OBV model, we have our pressured data, so whether the ball carried was pressured or not. But with 360, we don't need the pressured thing. We've got the location of the players within the 360 frame. So that gives a much richer kind of information in terms of where the players are on the pitch and the pressure on the ball carrier. So in terms of the actual features going into the graph neural network, on the nodes, we encode the location of the players on the pitch, who the ball carrier is, the goalkeeper if they're present, and also the distance and angle to the ball carrier. On the edges, we represent the relationship to the ball carrier, whether they're the teammate or the opponent. And these exist outside of the graph structure, but these are global features, so they represent the context, so again, open play, free kick, the body part, and also, crucially, the field of view. And it's important to include that information in the model. So for example, in the bottom right here, we can see we've got quite a good view of the attacking half of the pitch, but we know, from a football kind of watching perspective, if there are 15 players in the frame or 2, we can probably infer a lot about maybe what the context is in that given situation, just from a single frame and how many we can see. So feed that through our, yeah, that's supposed to be hidden. Good stuff. There we go. So we feed that through our machine learning model, and we get our probabilities out. So this is, these are 6 random frames from the Leeds United versus Liverpool match earlier in the season, where there's a high short possession probability. And generally, like what we see in these sorts of situations is the ball carrier is under a lot of pressure, or their like passing options are blocked, or it's just harder to like pass the ball out or dribble away. You're in a sort of situation where it's harder to retain possession. And like an example of this is here. I've flipped around the frame to make this a little bit easier in terms of orientation. So for for example, I did want to show those ones. Oh well, I'll come back to it. It's fine. This isn't going out live, is it? So in this situation, Fabinho's on the ball. He's looking for a passing option. He's going to pass it back to Joel Matip. So in this situation, again, from watching football, like we can see a decent half of the decent proportion of the pitch here, but we can probably infer, given this situation, that the rest of the players aren't hiding off in the bottom right-hand corner. They're probably going to be in the opposition half. So that tells us something. And that is the case. So Joel Matip, he drives the ball forward. He's playing against Leeds. There's heavy congestion ahead, and he tries to pass the ball off and loses possession. So now if we skip back. This is the flip side. We're looking at long possession probabilities. So again, 6 random frames. And what we tend to see in this situation is that players, they might be under pressure, but they've got like passing options. Maybe they can pass the ball backwards. They're potentially under pressure, but they've got options to retain possession. Here's another example. It's flipped around again. So Leeds are on the ball. Again, we've got a good view of the pitch. We can see a lot of players. But again, from watching football, in this situation, you can probably guess that there's a player hiding off screen to the right-hand side here. And that is the case. The model doesn't know this. But it's seen a lot of situations like this in terms of the frames, and it can kind of say, oh, okay, well, I've seen a lot of given situations like this, so maybe this is going to be a longer possession. And it is, it's an easy pass off. They're able to retain possession relatively easily, and that's kind of the picture of what gets painted. And then, finally, we've got the high shot possession probabilities. And generally, in these cases, I filtered this just to the midfield third, just to kind of have a more consistent kind of comparison with the other frames. But generally, in these situations, it's the ball carriers. They've got good passing options. Maybe somebody's in out wide, or there's a through ball, somebody in space that can get into the attacking third. So again, here's another little still. Naby Keita's brought the ball forward. Liverpool are on the attack, so obviously Andy Robertson is overlapping on the left-hand side here. There's a relatively easy pass on for Robertson. He gets the ball. He's in a good crossing position. He puts the cross in. It actually goes behind for a corner. Liverpool get a shot from the ensuing corner. And per our possession definition, that counts as a possession with a shot. And so that was a very micro-level, zoomed-in view. We can also zoom out and look at team-level sort of tendencies over a full season. So all the teams here are out of possession, and we're looking in the short possession probability above and below average. I split the pitch into 6 different zones. So the attacking team is defending from left to right, so the defending team is from right to left. So dark red colors mean that a team has a greater probability of short possessions, so shorter possessions. Dark blue means lower than average short possession probability, so longer possessions. And I'm not expecting you to take all this in. There's a lot of detail here, which is good, but also time is limited. But you can see that Leeds obviously really stick out. Nicole's done a lovely job beforehand demonstrating that. There's that heavy press all over the pitch. Liverpool, Manchester City crop up. We see Southampton, quite intense press in the midfield. We also see the flip side of that. Teams like Wolves and Crystal Palace, when the opposition have the ball in their defensive third, they're tending to drop off into more of a mid or lower block. So their opponents tend to have longer possessions in those zones. But we also see sort of flips in terms of tactics. Like Burnley are a good example here. In the opposition half, they will often sort of press up higher and make the possessions shorter. Whereas if the ball comes particularly into their defensive third, they will retreat into that sort of congested area, try and block off things. And we can look at the conceding shots flip side. So again, so red colors mean that teams have a higher shot possession probability against them, so they concede more shots. Dark blue means that they concede fewer shots than the league average. And this is where we see the sort of push-pull of Leeds United. If you can get into their sort of into their defensive third, and particularly around the penalty area, you've got through that suffocating press. A lot of the time, you're going to be through their last line and in a good position to generate shots. Again, Burnley are a nice example here as well in terms of they might push up higher up the pitch, but they retreat back, and again, they're in sort of positions where they're quite likely to concede shots. You do see teams that are really good at suppressing shots, like around their own box. So like Brighton and Chelsea really stick out here. So that's very much a sort of big picture view. But the nice thing with this sort of stuff is, obviously Leeds are the poster boys here. But we can the nice thing is that we've got this sort of rich data set, this detail. We can have a look at our data. So here I've plotted the 15 possession states with the highest short possession probability from Leeds in the midfield third. So I've basically just run some queries. I've plotted them all here. Again, not expecting you to see them all, but from a data point of view, we could have a good look at these. We're playing the Leeds next week. We can dial up however many different matches we want to look at. We can have a look, okay, well, what are the similarities here? Are they, is it a lot of the time on the flank? How many players are they committing to these kind of situations? We can dial up like a video playlist, And what's nice about this from doing it from a sort of modeling context rather than like a data-driven context. So in a data-driven context, we might, okay, well, show me situations where Leeds won the ball back in 5 seconds. But then we're only focusing essentially on the good outcome. Whereas really, if we want to exploit things, we also want to see what happens, when they fail to do that. And also, sort of maybe there are things that we can spot if we sort of expand our data set in terms of what we're seeing and what we're studying on like the video and things. We can have maybe a better, broader kind of view of what they're trying to do and, hopefully exploit it. So finally, I want to come on to that push-pull, that meta game that I talked about. So what was, sort of really noticeable and not a surprising finding, but if you look on a match-by-match basis at teams over a course of a season, you can see that some teams very much change their approach depending on who they're playing, whether that's a strength or style kind of thing, and also if they're home or away. So Burnley were a really good example of this. If they were playing weaker teams, particularly at home, they would push up the pitch, whereas if they're playing stronger teams like Manchester City, Liverpool, and particularly away from home, they would be much more in that sort of drop back and defend, their own final third and penalty box kind of area. But that does okay, well, why is that in terms of, is that because Liverpool, Manchester City have, exceptional players, they have good possession structures, and they're able to just change things from that point of view? Are they forcing Burnley into that, or is that Burnley changing their approach? So there's that push-pull. So we could just leave it there and just, okay, fine, we can see that. But we could build another model, because, that's what I do. So I built a Bayesian hierarchical model, which tried to control for a team's overarching approach, their tendencies at home versus away, and also opposition team strength, because that's a really big driver of what we see. So the models fit against the predicted short possession probability for each possession state observation. And yeah, the idea here is that we get a better contextual view, separating out some of the important drivers to really see what a team is trying to do in a sort of average situation. They're playing on an average team like an Arsenal or something like that. So that's good from a planning point of view, right? We're playing them next week. What are they actually going to do? So yeah, Bayesian hierarchical modeling. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm sure you're happy about that. So yeah, we've got the probability of a short possession. So that's adjusted to a Z-score, which makes it just a little bit easier to fit the model. We then have these in and out of possession terms. So that encodes the teams playing in the given match. So that's their baseline approach. What are they trying to do in general? We then have these in possession and out of possession home terms that represent their approach away versus home versus away. That will differ depending on who's playing at home and if they're in possession or out of possession. Obviously, there's a big caveat here. This is last season, games played primarily without crowds. I think there's probably some interesting follow-on research here in terms of, looking at games with crowds back in. And then finally, we also encode the relative team strength of the two teams. And that's the in possession expected goal difference of the team and the out of possession, minus the out of possession team's expected goal difference. So firstly, team strength. Massive impact in terms of what we see on the pitch. So along the bottom, on the x-axis, we've got the in-possession team's expected goal difference minus the out-of-possession team's expected goal difference. This is like the fit from the model. So stronger teams are to the right, weaker teams to the left. On the y-axis, we've got the change in the short possession probability towards the top, shorter possessions towards the bottom, longer possessions. So we know this, but it's always nice to see that from the model. The stronger the team in possession is, the longer a possession is. Now, if we can remove that from the model, because it's a big driver of what we actually see on the pitch, we can isolate teams, overarching tendencies. And that's shown here. So the nice thing with the Bayesian modeling is that you get a full distribution. You get the uncertainty of what the model thinks is happening, essentially. And that's represented by these distributions here. So on this, it's plotting their sort of overall tendency, their overarching tendency when out of possession. So teams to the right-hand side, shorter possessions. Teams to the left-hand side, longer possessions. So obviously, Leeds really stick out here. We see Liverpool, Southampton. On the flip side, we see the sort of more low-block teams, West Ham United, Newcastle. And then we see Burnley in fourth, which might be somewhat counterintuitive. But this is why removing the team strength angle makes a big difference. Burnley are generally at a significant talent disadvantage. But when that talent disparity is much more even, they do push up. They have quite a different approach to a lot of what you might all call lower block teams. So it's kind of interesting, we can see something slightly different. It does show up to some extent in there, if you take that big average over a season, but we've sort of quantified this a little more. Manchester City dropped down a little bit, and that again is because they generally have a huge talent advantage over almost every team in the league. So it's kind of just dampening that down a little. And we can also look at this home versus away. So just on average, teams have shorter possessions away from home when they're the defending team. So again, teams to the right, they have shorter possessions at home. Teams to the left have shorter possessions away. So Chelsea, when they're playing behind us here, they tend to have shorter possessions at home. They're pushing up more. They're pushing up higher up the pitch. They're pressing more. Southampton, particularly, we can see a skew there. Manchester City tend to drop off. Again, this is sort of modified by their team strength, but they tend to drop off more when they're at home versus away. And so this was over the full pitch, but we can also just restrict our data to the midfield. And again, Leeds really jump out here. This is like a massive difference from this sort of type of modeling. Southampton really jump out. Burnley push up again because we're more focusing on those areas higher up the pitch where they do like to push up. Liverpool, and again, we sort of see the flip side in terms of the teams that tend to retreat off at the other side of the scale. And then again, we can look at that home versus away tendency. So again, teams to the right, shorter possessions at home. Teams to the left, shorter possessions away. And we see a broadly sort of similar pattern. That skew with Manchester City isn't as high. What's kind of interesting is that teams that you might associate with pressing don't have the same sort of setup. Some teams are more consistent home versus away. Others, they do quite strongly modify their approach, which is kind of interesting. We're not just saying all these teams press all the time. It's kind of, which is an interesting thing to be able to look at and quantify. So finally, I just wanted to kind of finish on the trade-offs of this kind of stuff, which I personally I think is the interesting thing. Well, hopefully it was all interesting, but so as well as the model I've just been talking about with the Bayesian model, I also fit this against the shot possession probability stuff. So along the bottom, we've got teams to the right, shorter possessions, teams to the left, longer possessions. Teams towards the top tend to concede more shots. Teams to the bottom concede fewer shots. And there's a broad kind of correlation here. Teams that tend to have, teams that press or have shorter possessions against them tend to concede fewer shots. They suppress shots. Teams that tend to drop off tend to concede more shots. Obviously, again, Leeds, massive outlier. They have that highest sort of intensity out of possession, but it is that sort of trade-off in terms of they are going to leave themselves open to be exploited in terms of shots. It's not necessarily saying that's a bad approach. They're obviously very successful to it, and maybe there's advantages in being that extreme an outlier. But there's always that push-pull, and I think it's interesting to try and unpick that. And there are things that can be exploited, from a opposition analysis, and also sort of looking at overarching team styles, etc. So thanks very much.